So my apologies again. These may happen in snippets. I'm having phone problems. Regardless, so you mentioned normative and prescriptive, and I've talked about that. There can be no moral heroes if there's no such thing as an objective moral. If there's no objective morals, then anybody who disagrees with a culture's standing morality is really just a troublemaker or stupid. So I'm not ready to go there. I hope you're not. I do think men like Gandhi and Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who resisted the Nazis, and Martin Luther King, and anyone who marched with him, I believe those were moral heroes. They stood for things that were right, contrary to law. And this is another point that you need to keep in mind from the book, the textbook, and the introduction to the textbook, if you remember those Roman numeral pages. Laws and morals are not the same thing. Customs and morals are not the same thing. Right? An objectivist isn't going to say that every custom is an absolute standard. There's room for some relativity within objective morals. What do I mean by that? So if the moral is I should be polite and respectful of other people, that I should treat them as people, as worthy of respect because they're people, and in an understanding way, that's a way I show respect for people, is how I treat them, then I would do well to understand their customs. So for instance, like with eating, I love Ethiopian food. Ethiopian food has this bread called injera. You eat Ethiopian food with your fingers. You share a common central plate. You break off a piece of the bread and you eat, and that's polite and that's normal. There are places and settings where that is impolite. To go into the house of an Ethiopian person who offers me their food and insist upon a fork if they don't offer them to begin with, is rude. To go into a place where they have the place settings with fine china and a salad fork and a dinner fork and a dessert spoon, etc., etc., and to not at least try to observe what's going on and use them, is also rude. And so the ethical stance is I should be polite and respectful of people's customs. But the custom itself is different from the moral. Part of being moral is to recognize the difference of custom. There are places where they overlap, and that can create difficulties. There were times and places in Alaska, certain tribes, that if you came as a guest to a village, a man was to offer his wife to you to sleep with to keep you warm. Now, that custom, we can discuss, is that moral? I think it's immoral to ask a woman to sleep with a man she doesn't know just to keep him warm because he's a guest. So a custom, we could argue, is moral or immoral or really neutral. There's such a thing as a neutral custom. Customs and morality can overlap, but they're not the same thing, and we need to recognize that. Laws and morality are related and can overlap, but they're not the same thing, and we need to understand that. There again, otherwise you can't have moral heroes, because oftentimes moral heroes reject local customs or regional or local laws because the law or the custom is deemed as immoral, as wrong. And they're appealing to something higher than custom or law when they say this is wrong. Jim Crow laws were wrong. It wasn't just that they were no longer customary or legal, they were wrong. They became illegal because people understood that they were wrong and fought to get rid of them. if morality is completely relative, then why would anybody ever fight to get rid of an immoral law? Why would we even talk like that? Now, many of you are going to say, oh, it's relative, but notice in your own language. A few of you are like, somebody talked about, I think stealing is wrong, but if I were hungry and my family was starving, I would justify stealing. Notice that word justify. What do you mean by that? To make just. You can't make anything just if there's no such thing as justice. And if there's no such thing as true morality or ethics, then there's no such thing as justice. And you can't make something, you can't justify something, you can't make it just, because justice doesn't exist. So I hope that makes sense. So essentially, when you say, if my family were starving, I might feel it was okay to steal to feed them, you're not saying at that point that stealing is a good thing. You're saying one obligation outweighs another. The fact that there's an obligation means that there's a moral standard. There is an objective standard. What you're essentially saying is human life is more important than human property. That's an objective moral standard. If you think saving a life justifies stealing food, then you have an objective moral standard, because you're saying the life has greater true, real value than the object. Now, we can debate that because there's a lot to take into consideration, right? Did I ask for the food? Am I stealing from somebody who also is poor and lacks food? Would it be more just to steal from a rich person than another poor person? See, if any of those things complicate that issue for you, then you have an objective moral standard, even if you don't want to admit it. If life trumps stuff, you have an objective moral standard. So, if you're going to use the language of justification, you have some kind of moral standard, because there's no such thing as justification if there's no justice. And there can't be justice if there's no true standard of what's right. So, recognize that, think that through. I'd love to see your responses. You're always free to post videos yourself. I can watch them or continue typing responses. But please, let's keep it in one thread. Thanks.